became a postman, delivering mail by day and playing concerts by night.
I met Bon at Fremantle Post Office in late 1967. We were postmen together. Bon was, you know, laughing all the time and, you know, generally having a good time. But, you know, with Bon, it was something like two lives. He'd come to work, but he'd virtually have his clothes on that he'd been working on at night, not have his uniform on. He'd just say where he'd been playing and where he was going to play and that type of thing. He actually said to us, you know, why don't you come and see us some night when we're playing? So, you know, we went to, I think it was Swanbourne Beach down there when he played at the Swanbourne Stomp down there. But we used to go, well, my mates and I used to go to different stomps around the area, and he happened to be in one of them. Swanbourne was the main one. He had a very good personality. He was a likeable chap and you know, easy to get on with. So his personality, I'd say, was at the time better than his singing. But in the end, he was more known for his singing than his personality. But I think he had both, and that was one of his pluses.
In the end, it was Bon's friendship with Vince Lovegrove that proved to be the most fruitful for his career and turned him from a drummer into a frontman.
I suggested to him one time that he should, you know, sing more rather than play drums, but it wasn't his band. The band was led by John Collins, and he was the man, he was the singer, and there wasn't any way that Bon was going to make it to be full-time singer of that band. And because both of the bands were in competition, it was a very competitive field at that time, I suggested to Bon that we join ranks and form one band and have two lead singers.
The Valentines were born and soon developed into the biggest gigging band in Perth.
I can think my skin is green, but the trees are pink. For colours they don't mean.
In particular, the distinctive teaming of the two charismatic frontmen set the band apart from their contemporaries.
They're both pretty smooth back in those days when I come to think about it. But Vince was more laid back, obviously, than Bon because of the personality. And Vince had this aura of, you know, this star aura, whereas Bon had this mischief, this thing about him, this twinkle in his eye, this look on his face that would sort of bounce off Vince. Vince was the cooler one, you know, and it was most interesting to see that.
The main reason we did it was because probably both of us weren't really confident enough to lead a band on our own, and we worked off each other a lot. We had a pretty wild stage act for the time. You know, we should jump up on amps and have fire bombs going off on stage, and you know, all sorts of weird stuff. And we fired off each other. You know, we definitely gelled, and we'd work out stuff beforehand, what we would do and what we wouldn't do.
With the Spectres and the Valentines, which came along a little bit later, and the Valentines were a fusion of the Spectres and Vince Lovegrove's other band, I think they were called the Winstons, but they also came out of another thing that was kind of influential in Australia, which European people would recognise, was that whole instrumental rock tradition of like the Shadows. And so in Perth in the early 60s, you had what were called stomps. That was like dances that surfies went to, because there's a big surf scene, there's great beaches over there. And so there was a bit of that Shadows sound that was like surf music sort of coming in a bit. And the kids, these were just teenage boys taking on electric guitars because they saw Hank Marvin doing it, and the Beatles come along and they got long hair and they're singing. So the Australian groups, and particularly in Perth, be really isolated, really just making up the rules for yourself, because there were absolutely no parameters or no possibilities. It's just a whole new thing.
The Valentines entered the recording studio and began to release singles across Australia. This brought them to the attention of George Young and Harry Vander, who enlisted them to support the Easy Beats on tour in Perth. Yet, despite their success, they couldn't afford to give up the day jobs.
Bon used to be a postman, and I worked at a place called Palouse Menswear in Fremantle. He was a postie in Fremantle, so on his rounds he'd drop mail off to Palouse Menswear, where I worked, and we'd go out and have a drink, or we'd go around the corner and have a snort of speed or whatever, you know, and we'd go back to our respective jobs. and he, during the daytime, we saw each other. We'd have lunch together, or whatever. He'd come as soon as he came around to Palouse. That was when I would knock off and take some time off, whether it was lunch or afternoon tea, morning tea, and we'd go and dream our dream of what we're going to do, what the next move was going to be, and what we're going to do next. And that's when we concocted the plan. Well, let's get out of here. Let's go over to Melbourne.
The Perth music scene was getting too constraining for the Valentines, and they decided to enter a Battle of the Bands competition, with the first prize a trip to London.
It was a nationwide competition, so each state would have their own mini Battle of the Bands, and we won Perth's Battle of the Bands, and our prize was to go to Melbourne, not to London, but to go to Melbourne to compete in the national Battle of the Bands. Well, that was a big trip for us. We thought that was, the best thing that ever happened. So we decided to use that as our gauge as to whether or not we would leave Perth. We went over, and of course we played in a big hall. There was 5,000 screaming fans. There was another 12 bands on, or 11 bands on. It was incredible. You only did 2 songs. You could work out a great set with 2 songs, great stage act, great, everything was great. We went on there. We didn't win. But what we did do during the 3 or 4 days we were there was go to every single club in Melbourne and see that it was a completely different world to where we came from in Perth. So we decided there and then, okay, this is it, let's go, let's come over here. So we went back home and worked towards going over, and it was about 6 months later that we left to go to Melbourne.
The move to Melbourne was timely. Not only was the city's music scene more advanced, it allowed the band to put their talent to the test as professional musicians.
They went to Melbourne from Perth, and Melbourne was the pop capital where you had Go Set magazine and sort of TV shows like Commotion, and all this stuff was happening there. And bands like the Valentines, even a third level ordinary band could be doing 3 gigs a night, because you do a suburban dance hall and a city nightclub and whatever. And so what that was the thing that still does make Australian bands great, is that ability to play, is just play on stage to people. And I think that was the training ground there. If you've got 3 gigs a night, you've got to get reasonably adept,
When we hit Melbourne, we made a band decision. It was a band rule that, and it was a very democratic band, but as anybody will tell you, any democratic band always has trouble and isn't really democratic in the end. The singers really run the show. And we made a pact in the band that we weren't going to do what everyone else was doing at that stage, which is, 66. And that was take drugs and smoke pot. And I can remember Bon and I, when we went up to Sydney one time, and it was the first time either of us had ever had a joint, late in the piece. It wasn't around when you were 15, 16 in those days. We were 20, 21. We went up to Sydney, and we went and saw this band that we knew, and the keyboard player invited us back to his place to smoke some dope, and it was the first time, and we were both nervous as shit. And we went back there and we smoked and got completely out of our head, and we were just shit scared in the corner of the room, giggling and wondering whether we should be there. And eventually we just slid our way out of the room, completely paranoid, and ran down, bursting out laughing, and went back to the hotel, to the one room that we were staying at. It was a hotel called the Crest Hotel in King's Cross, which no longer exists. It's been pulled down, but we went back there. And of course the band knew immediately that we'd smoked, and we got ostracised and told we were going to be kicked out of the band, right, which we completely laughed about and went and celebrated and went to a club and got shit-faced drunk, because we thought the gall of the band thinking that they could throw us out of the band. And we always used to have breakfast around the corner. We used to go around there, and they used to have fresh orange juice, and we went round there, and we'd always go there because after a hard night's drinking it's good to have a bit of orange juice. So we went round there, and we were in one table and the band was on the other table, and they wouldn't speak to us because we'd smoked dope, and we were still stoned. We were still stoned. And anyway, eventually what happened was a member of the band came over and said, well, it's okay, we'll let you go this time and we'll let you back into the band. And it was just a funny thing,
Despite continued singles success, over the next 2 years the cracks began to show. A very public drugs bust resulted in unwanted press attention, and the light naivety of the Valentines' early image became tainted.
Bon and I started talking about it, we're going nowhere. We tried it out for 6 months, but we just, we were only being kept alive by publicity about pot, not by what we were doing. which was good, but we weren't playing at the right places, and we got lost basically. And so we got together, Bon and I, and decided that, and we felt we had the right to do it because we formed the band in the first place, that we would leave the band and that we'd get on with our other things. And we announced it to the band. It didn't go down all that well, obviously, with them or with our management at that stage. But we felt it was for the best.
Whereas Lovegrove moved into music journalism, Bon continued his dream for stardom and joined Fraternity, a heavyweight hippie group modelled on Robbie Robertson's The Band.
Bon had found his niche, that was what he needed, and